Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Guy Swan. I'm the Vice President for Education here at the Association of the United States Army, and I'd like to welcome you to the General Gordon R. Sullivan Conference and Event Center on behalf of our boss, General Carter Ham, the President of AUSA, who is presently, Dave, I think probably on the train right now back from New York City, and may or may not get to join us later this evening. I mentioned the General Sullivan Conference and Event Center. Some of you have been in here. This has been open for about the last 2.5 years. There's a plaque out front that we always refer you to of General Sullivan, and as the theory goes, if you rub his chin, that gives you good luck. So on your way out, you might want to do that. A couple of thoughts here before we get started. Each year, our Institute of Land Warfare at AUSA, which is our primary educational arm, produces a variety of publications to broaden the professional understanding of major national security issues facing our country, with, of course, special emphasis on the United States Army, land forces, and their role in our national defense. Some of those publications you can grab on your way out include a series we call the Spotlight, which are a series of shorter, hard-hitting papers that focus on issues of a contemporary nature, things that are occurring right now in the U.S. Army that the Army asks us to spread the word on to get their message out. There's an always popular publication called The Profile of the U.S. Army. It's a thicker volume, but it is the quintessential primer on the United States Army. For those folks who don't follow the Army, it is Army A to Z in a short volume. We have a very resurgent and very successful book program, which offers a wide variety of titles on military, defense, and historical issues as well. And a long-standing series of Landpower essays and land warfare papers, both of which focus on intellectually stimulating research, especially by emerging Army leaders like the folks we have here tonight. Historically, we've selected papers written by young leaders like the ones we have tonight for presentation at the AUSA annual meeting, which was held earlier this month. But this year we had over 31,000 attendees, over 300 speakers, over 740 exhibitors across the 3-day convention, which was the most we've had since 2012. So a very successful event. And with so much going on at the annual meeting, we did not feel that we could do justice to the hard and insightful work done by our authors here tonight. So we decided to extract this from the annual meeting and establish a separate forum, which brings us here tonight. We're especially pleased and privileged to have as our moderator a good friend and a tremendous distinguished soldier, General Retired Dave Perkins. General Perkins retired earlier this year after serving over 38 years on active duty in the United States Army. His final assignment was as the commanding general for the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command. His other commands include commanding general of the Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth, commanding general of the 4th Infantry Division, and commander of the 2nd Brigade of the 3rd Infantry Division during the invasion of Iraq in 2003, where his unit was the first unit across the border and the first unit to enter downtown Baghdad, as many of you recall. I might add also that at the time of his retirement, General Perkins led the discussion and in fact was the architect of what is now called multi-domain operations. This is an emerging doctrine that is now in use and driving America's military, all services, on the way we will organize, train, and equip for the foreseeable future. I'm going to let General Perkins introduce our guest tonight, but please join me in a warm welcome for General Dave Perkins. Okay, Dave, all yours, all yours.
Well, Guy, thanks for that overly kind introduction, and I'd like to thank you, SMA, and General Ham when he gets back for all the great work that AUSA does for our Army and by association for our nation, really. And now that I'm out of uniform, I can push AUSA membership and all kinds of great things like that without the lawyers hounding me. So thanks for having me here. You're all great friends, and it's just an honor to be part of AUSA. A couple of firsts here this evening. We're going to have some great presentations by these young majors here, and it's the first time they've presented their work in an AUSA forum like this, and this is my first presentation in the AUSA forum, not wearing the uniform that they're wearing. So we're all in brand new roles here. So these are all leader development experiences for all of us. As we go through here, we have and I was talking to some of the guests here earlier this evening, what is, I think, really intellectually stimulating is we have a huge array of topics here, everything from space operations to siege mentality and stealth catapults. I'd like to publicly commend these young majors for the work they put into this, because they are doing what we want true professionals to do in our Army, and that is take ownership of the profession, become engaged in it both physically and intellectually, show the commitment that you can see they've put into their work here, and as well as display their competence. And you'll also see a level of insight that I can honestly tell you I absolutely did not have as a major. I'm sure Guy did, but I did not. About the complexity, not only of the world that we face right now, but the complexity that is only going to increase if we, as we continue down the road to the future. And they really thought hard about this. And I think not only have highlighted some problems that we deal with now, but have tried to describe them well of what they're going to be like in the future and give us some ideas what to do about them. So in the absence of a better organizing principle, we decided to go in alphabetical order here. And after we decided to go in alphabetical order, we realized actually the topics follow one another pretty well. Now, I don't know if that's just us taking our own guidance to heart, but what I will ask you, they're all going to give you a 5 to 8 minute presentation. Take good notes. I'd like to get through all their presentations first, and then we'll open up to Q&A. And you can either address the group as a whole, because there are some patterns here you'll see that really address all the topics, or you can address them specifically. But we're going to try to divide our time evenly here this evening. And so the guidance I've given them is you need to take what could be a 3-hour lecture and put it into a good pithy 5-minute presentation, hitting all the high points and not repeating yourself. And then, gear it up to a good conversation. And in the second half, we'd like to have a dialogue with the audience. So with that introduction, Andrew, I'll pass it off to you.
Thank you, sir. And General Perkins, I'm on.
No, you're good.
Yep. Yeah, you're good. Cool. General Perkins, General Swan, Friends of AUSA, thank you very much for having me. I'm Major Andrew Boyd. I'm the operations officer for 11 Cav down at Fort Bliss, Texas, home of the 1st Armored Division. With the theme of this forum being readiness, I'm very happy to present my paper, which focuses on satellite communication systems and ground communication systems, as those systems, which we depend, are very related to readiness. I argue in my paper, which hopefully some of you have been able to read, that we, as the United States Ground Forces, we are and we will be significantly vulnerable in conflicts due to 2 things. Our over-reliance on satellite communications and a degraded readiness of our force to fight if we lose satellite connectivity, and then also a degraded readiness in our ability to counter an electronic warfare threat on the ground. There are some places simply that satellite communications does not work, and that's why that reliance is dangerous. As well, we likely won't be able to rely on that satellite communication systems in close combat with a near-peer threat. When we transition to our terrestrial ground-based communication systems, we won't know how to use those systems without being detected. The art of radio silence, emission control, that's something we just have not practiced in quite some time. Starting off with the most practical matter, SATCOM will not work in areas north of 65 degrees latitude or south of 65 degrees latitude, and it becomes very difficult to use in rugged terrain at those northern extremes. A NATO ally, Norway, where we have prepositioned stock with the Marine Corps prepositioning program. That's right around that 65-degree latitude place, and that's where we would have a base of operations from which to expand if we were to go to the aid of our NATO ally, Norway, in a conflict in Northern Europe. As well, another vulnerability, 90% of the satellites we use are commercial, not military, 90%. So that means only 10% is military grade. AFRICOM used the Chinese satellite APSTAR 7 for 2 years because they needed it so much. That's how reliant we are on satellite communications. As well, a state may deny a company from providing satellite connectivity, satellite bandwidth to us if they wanted to remain neutral with a party that we were at war with. As well, belligerents out there, they can jam satellites. Russia and China have shot satellites out of the sky a few decades ago for Russia, 2007 for China. Russia has launched satellites into space which have literally rammed other satellites as though they were practicing anti-satellite warfare, and as well with robotic arms which could potentially fix or completely disable one of our communications satellites. So fortunately, despite these threats, most of our systems rely on satellite communications. We require a lot of bandwidth. We conduct video teleconferencing, we send gigabytes worth of files. A lot of our systems like Command Post of the Future, Distributed Common Ground System, also known as DCIGs, they require so much bandwidth, the only way they can operate is with, in an expeditionary environment, is with satellite communications. So what's going to happen if we lose satellite communication systems? It's much more easily said than done that we will transition to combat net radio. You'll have Corps and Division and Brigade headquarters getting closer to the front. We'll probably jettison some of the equipment we don't need on the ground to communicate with communication satellites, but it's quite likely it's much more easily said than done. We have not had the ability to practice emission control, radio silence, masking our emissions with the terrain around us, and employing electronic countermeasures. We used to be good at it, and back during World War II, there would be whole paragraphs dedicated in operation orders for amphibious assaults in the Philippines, dedicated to directing subordinate units to maintain radio listening silence until the assault began. So there were no radio rehearsals before an amphibious assault because it would give too much information to the enemy about where we were located and what we were doing. And there's a good quote from the paper from the 6th Infantry Division's order for the amphibious assault on Luzon. Maximum use of pigeons will be made whenever practicable. So even back during World War II, when HF, high frequency radio, VHF, that was the SATCOM of the day, you had a commander who was more willing to have his subordinates communicate with him through a pigeon than through a radio, because he did not want his subordinate units to give away their position, and he was willing to give up a little bit of control over his subordinates so that he was more successful in the amphibious assault. So what are we looking like today? You know, with the fall of the Soviet Union, that coincided with some technological developments, the fielding of the SINCARS radio frequency hopping in 1988, and as we increased and improved our technology for electronic countermeasures against EW threats, a lot of those threats from the Soviet Union decreased. So what you see today, although there was a Cold War doctrine that had a lot of positive emphasis on how to communicate with combat net radio without giving away your position and allowing the enemy to triangulate you, we now have doctrine that is almost completely silent on emission control and nearly completely void of techniques for countering an enemy's electronic warfare threats. So today, you could see it in Ukraine with the conflict that's gone on there for the past few years. The ability of the Russian-backed separatists to identify static positions of the Ukrainian army through their electronic warfare capabilities. This has definitely resonated with some members of our force, and General Milley, to quote him, he describes a future enemy where drones and sensors are constantly on the hunt for targets and warn that if you stay in one place longer than 2 or 3 hours, you will be dead. So we know there's a threat out there. We know that it's capable of identifying us. Yet right now what I see is the fielding of a lot of equipment that gives out more of a signature, all for the end of achieving a greater sharing of information, which is good, but not if it leads to the enemy always knowing where you are. So to summarize the problem and keeping this short, we're over-reliant on SATCOM. Many of our systems can't function without it. There are places on the Earth where SATCOM simply won't work due to satellite geometry. There are significant threats to SATCOM, which Russia and China do possess. And when we transition to our terrestrial combat net radio, we probably will not have the institutional knowledge and the equipment in order to counter that threat. What are my recommendations to move beyond this and be prepared for this type of threat in a anti-satellite and electronic warfare environment? Equip our ground forces with what I call smart antennas, which are directional, which can allow you to transmit not only longer, but to the units that you need to transmit and not further beyond that or not outside of that radius, so that enemy direction finders and jammers cannot target friendly units. Revamp the doctrine so that our communications doctrine doesn't just teach our soldiers and our leaders how to effectively communicate, but how to effectively communicate with the systems and not give away our positions. And then, of course, train with that equipment and that doctrine. We've already anticipated this threat on the ground and in space, and now we must readjust our equipment, our training, and our doctrine to prepare for that threat. I would argue we don't need to wait for an emergency. We don't need to wait for soldiers to die, as we saw 2 Ukrainian mechanized infantry battalions be destroyed very quickly due to the technology that's out there. We don't need to wait for our Pearl Harbor, and we have anticipated the threats, and I think we have some solutions that we can very easily implement. That's what I have to say, and if there are no other comments, I'll pass it over to the next speaker, sir.
All right, thanks. We appreciate it. Amos?
Okay. I'd like to start off by thanking AUSA and the ILW team. I've always been a big fan of what ILW's done, and I've appreciated the work that they've done over the years. So thank you. I'd also like to start off quickly by thanking my chain of command back at Fort Bliss and the 1st Armored Division for allowing me and Andrew the opportunity to come up here during a busy training season that we got going on. So I'm Major Amos Fox. I'm the operations officer for 1st Battalion, 35th Armored and 2nd Brigade, 1st Armored Division. My paper is on siege warfare, or not siege warfare, but the reemergence of the siege, or the emergence, depending on which way you want to look at it, of the siege in modern war. So you may ask yourself, why the siege? And I start close and I'll work backwards a bit. I worked in the G5 or J5 when we were deployed, but for 1st Armored Division during the OIR campaign against ISIS in Iraq. And when I was sitting there, I saw in Syria specifically, but we caught the tail end of the Battle of Mosul, that there was a lot of legitimate sieges going on in Syria. And those kept coming to mind as I was looking around. The sieges ended in Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor while we were there. The Battle of Mosul was essentially a siege in itself. And then when I zoomed out, I saw that it wasn't just in the Middle East that sieges were happening. There was also a siege going on in the Philippines and the counter-ISIS campaign there, specifically the Battle of Marawi, which went from March to October of 2017. And so that was forming in my mind while I was sitting in Baghdad trying to figure out what was next with Andrew here. And then it also had me reflect on what I'd worked on when I was in SAMS. My monograph was on the Russo-Ukrainian War and how that was fought, especially in the early stages. And during that campaign as well, the early part of that campaign, there was a series of sieges there as well. And so as I looked around, I just saw sieges kept popping to the top, on top of other things. And then as I reflected on what exists in doctrine, what exists in the contemporary discussion, we talk about fighting in megacities, we talk about the return of conventional warfare, but the discussion of the siege specifically is absent from the discussion. And so I saw it as a knowledge gap that I wanted to fill. So that's why I wrote what I wrote. Getting into some of the, I'm going to hit the high points because we're limited on time, but don't let your mind wander. When you think about sieges, it's not trebuchets and ballistas firing at fortified walls of castles. It's a bit different today than what it was then. However, the common definition says that a siege is a military blockade of a city or fortified place to compel it to surrender, or it's a persistent or serious attack. The first part of that's not necessarily true today as it used to be, but the second part is. Also, it's important to note the difference between a siege and siege warfare. So my paper says that sieges are back, but siege warfare is not back. A siege is a tool in the kit bag of war that people are using for a variety of ends. But siege warfare, just going out and doing sieges and that being it, that is not back. So I just wanted to point that out and make that distinction so that everybody's aware of that. So with the siege, it's important to think about the traditional definition, but then also I think it's important to note that it's very similar as well to the old Prussian or German idea of the Kesselschlacht. And pardon my German, I don't speak German, so that's as good as it gets. But it's basically the isolation and encirclement and the concentric attack of an opponent or an adversary there. And they can both be terrain focused or it can be enemy focused, depending on the situation. And similar to the past, modern sieges appear to have two goals today. That's to achieve a decision, whether that be militarily or politically, or both, or to just destroy whatever's in that siege area. And so if you take those two goals of the siege and look at the primary areas where sieges exist right now, Ukraine and the Middle East, the Philippines, that first one, the decision politically or militarily, you see a lot more in Ukraine, and the just basic destruction of things and stuff you see in the Middle East. However, that said, that those aren't universal. So going back to the start of modern sieges, I think most people in the room are probably fairly familiar with the Bosnian Wars. The siege of Sarajevo lasted 3.5 years, 10,000 killed. Largest siege since Stalingrad. Following that, the Second Chechen War, the Russians had some problems with the Northern Caucasus region in Dagestan, Chechnya, and Ingush. The siege lasted there a month and a half as part of that Battle of Grozny from December 99 to February of 2000. And there was upwards of 1,000 Russian soldiers killed. It's really hard to find data on Russian soldiers killed, by the way. But there was upwards of 1,000 Russian soldiers killed, 3,000 wounded, 200,000 Chechens killed in this campaign, and it flattened Grozny. And Grozny has since been rebuilt, and it's a very nice modern city. But that was a stepping off point, I think, for the return of these sieges today. And so they basically dissipated till about 2014. And then when Russia or the separatists, whichever way you want to look at it, invaded Ukraine, sieges came back. The first siege in that campaign was a enemy-focused siege at the Battle of Ilovaisk, where the Russians surrounded and destroyed a Ukrainian army, for lack of a better term. And that was a month-long siege that resulted in the Minsk Protocol. So it achieved not only a military decision, but also a political decision. And then we get into the Donetsk airport, the Second Battle of Donetsk airport, which also was a siege and resulted in the Ukrainian soldiers there holding out to the end, getting the nickname the cyborgs of Donetsk airport. And then the Battle of Debaltseve was a very traditional siege. Debaltseve was a very important road network that was the linchpin between the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic. The Ukrainians held it at that time, so it was a salient poking into that territory. The Russians poked it, anticipating that the Ukrainians would swarm in. When they swarmed in, they encircled it, they cut the power, they cut the water, and then they basically bled them out for about a month and a half. City of 25,000 people, 8,000 people fled the city, 6,000 people were killed in the siege of Debaltseve, and it resulted in the Minsk II Protocol being issued. And since then, there's not really been any large-scale fighting in Ukraine to the same level of intensity or ferocity since then. So again, that one achieved both the political and military decision. It's also worth noting, too, when we think about sieges, that it's not just the area being sieged, but there's basing required for sieges. And so in the paper I mentioned Pisky, the small little suburb of Donetsk, 2,000 people about 2 miles outside of the airport. And that city, because it was used as basing for the sieges that were going on there at the airport, ended up getting flattened as well. And now there's 18 to 20 people. Last thing I saw, that 18 to 20 people that are living there now. So moving beyond Europe, in the paper, there's a litany of sieges that I list in there. I'm not going to run through them all now, but quite a few going on in Syria, a couple in Iraq, and then again the one, Marawi in the Philippines. So there's been a rapid spike in the past couple of years of sieges. So starting in 2012 with Aleppo, and then going to today right now, there are several sieges going on, not only in the Middle East, but across the world. So the takeaway on all that, really, again, my paper wasn't intended to offer up advice on how to address the siege or anything. It was more just to inform and to bring to light the fact that this is back and to get the discussion going. So I think just a couple points, though. The rise of high-tech weaponry is potentially driving some of this, as well as people look to survive. They try and tuck into places that are hard to find, whether that's individual people or large formations of people. We saw this there at the tail end at the Battle of Mosul. ISIS was fighting to the bitter end, hunkered down, and everything they could. And so again, that resulted in a siege because they knew that we had the precision weaponry that could attack them fairly well if they came out into the open. And then the last point, or two last points. So there's a return of decisiveness to battle where these have happened. And again, it's important to realize or remember that decisiveness, just like defeat, is rarely permanent. It's temporal, and if we don't capitalize on the tactical and operational decisiveness and defeats, politically and strategically, we could squander that success that we've had at that level. And then the last point is that as I look more at this and I think more about it, I think the rise in the siege there's a correlation, and I don't know how tight the causality is, but there's a correlation between the rise in sieges and the rise in proxy wars that are going on today. And so as much as we try and polish up what it is that's going on wherever we're doing things, security force assistance, whatever you want to call it, partner operations, advise and assist, these rise in proxy wars that we're fighting, I think, is driving the increase in these sieges that we're seeing, which also, because it's almost a limited liability approach to fighting, we're not necessarily, we and the other people that are using proxies aren't concerned with the destruction that it causes. And so you see this rise in devastation as these sieges are conducted. So with that, sir.
All right, very good, thanks. Zachary, go ahead.
So I just want to start off by saying thank you, General Perkins and General Swan and AUSA, and especially the ILW team for helping with editing and working on this paper, because I'm the token infantryman and, not the greatest writer all the time. So I really got into NATO specifically for a couple reasons. One, it gave me a good excuse to go do research in Europe, which was awesome, and then also hopefully someday give me a good reason to get stationed there. But also, like a lot of other people in here, I did 3 deployments to Afghanistan and worked with a lot of our NATO allies. My last trip, I was a company commander in RC West under the Italian headquarters, and there was a lot of tension, a lot of issues, and I left that deployment kind of feeling like there would be some significant challenges if we actually had to fight as a cohesive alliance in the future. So it made me really want to look at NATO. Specifically, I wanted to look at alliance cohesion, coalition cohesion, and how you actually function effectively at the Joint Task Force level in the future. And I ended up deciding to look at political will, because that is essentially the foundation for all of that cohesion and common effort in conflict. And so I argue that NATO does not have the political will right now to defend the Baltics in the event of a conflict with Russia. And I'm not arguing that would be the case necessarily if there was a Pearl Harbor type event, because I think a Pearl Harbor event would create significant political will to act. But there's a lot of interest and a lot of reasons why a lot of allies would not necessarily choose to fight in the Baltics, especially given Russia's current modus operandi for operations, which are not necessarily large-scale armored invasions, but they're more subtle use of information operations and proxy forces and other things, using deception and ambiguity would make it really hard for NATO to generate the will to fight. And so when I define political will, there's 4 basic parts to it in the paper. One was you have to have support from sufficient decision makers to act. You have to have a common understanding of the threat or the problem. If you frame your problem differently, you understand the problem differently, you're not going to agree on the same solution. You have to have a commonly perceived, potentially effective solution that people agree on to use. And then the last thing is you have to have the commitment to sustain that action for as long as it takes to win the conflict or to execute, get the result that you'd like. And my paper did not look at commitment just because that's a huge topic and could use an entire paper on its own. So I looked at the first 3 criteria really to get a feel for would NATO's initial decision-making happen. And essentially I argued that the first criteria, having sufficient key leaders supporting using force, was problematic, largely because we've had declining champions. So historically the US president has been the champion that kind of herded the cats and got action. And that, along with the decline of a few of the European leaders' ability to generate collective action, has led to a decline in kind of that champions that can gather everybody and give people a common vision and purpose to act. You've also had a rise of veto players. So any state that would have an interest in vetoing action potentially causes problems because NATO has a consensus-based decision-making. So if you think about Turkey's recent relations with Russia and some of the other things going on, and some of the parties that have been elected in Eastern Europe, makes it probably questionable whether or not people will veto. And then there's also variable domestic influences. The second part, the common understanding, has been getting better over time, especially the later or the more recent NATO gatherings where they've increased their deterrent language. However, there's still some issues there. And then the final piece was having a potentially effective solution. I think that's the strongest metric. Obviously, NATO is the strongest alliance in the world, probably in history, and it could have the capability to solve just about any problem if it wants to. It's just, as you look at NATO a little bit deeper, there's all these problems that they don't really get around to solving until they absolutely have to. So we look at freedom of movement, our ability to communicate with our allies, our interoperability, all these problems that are really small and nagging that just don't get fixed. So the kind of takeaways to me related to readiness is, I think one of the first things I recommend is we need to get more officer and NCO exchange programs or cross assignments with our allies. And I would recommend doing that because I think that we need to improve our US language and cultural understanding to really be able to integrate and operate with allies. If you look at the infantry, I think there's 2 or 3 infantry captain assignments in the British Army for 2 years or 3 years. And there's really almost none to all of our other allies. And I think that would be some type of broadening assignment that would be both valuable if you send somebody to language school for 2 months and then assign them in a foreign military for 2 years, and you get them back and they have regional and local cultural experience and language skills that can then help the Army for a long time later. That is an easy solution that can really generate a lot of capability. The other thing is recognizing that adversaries like Russia are potentially setting the conditions to win a conflict before they ever get into it. So like Christopher's going to talk about with IO and fracturing the alliance and those types of things, I think they're really going to great lengths to separate and isolate areas to win before they ever actually start using force. And if we don't recognize that and we don't start acting on it in a variety of ways to prevent that, having military force may or may not actually matter by the time it comes to it. And there's a series of things, but I'll keep those short for later. That's really the purpose of the paper, the main outlines of it, and then I'll wait for questions later, sir.
All right, thanks. Christopher, wrap it up here.
Sir, could you throw the slides up? That'll be all right. So, good evening. I'm Major Chris Telley. I'm an IO officer and naval postgraduate student. I'd like to take a second to thank General Perkins, AUSA, as well as the sort of the esteemed crowd here for the opportunity for us to present our thoughts. It's an amazing thing that we get to do, so I'm really appreciative. My article is The Influence Machine. And it's a hypothetical. It's a combination of three specific capabilities that exist in the world today but have not yet been aggregated into one mechanism. So that's algorithmic content generation, precision targeting, and fire hose dissemination. I'll talk about those in general here in just a second. But the idea is that I'm going to contrast that with some other threats that come from military uses of AI, specifically drone swarms and task optimization. So I got this. So the crux of the paper is that I think that AI influence or automated influence is a bigger strategic threat than these other uses of the technology. Once again, drones and task optimization, and that we haven't addressed that threat with any meaningful action from the Department of Defense. For me, in the information operations business, this means that I'm taking automated or sort of advanced computational mechanisms. I'm feeding in modern data sets, and because of the abilities of those computers, I can get near human acuity on some of these influence tasks. And because I can get a computer to do them, I can do them at scale, repeatedly over long periods of time. So the folks who have sort of pioneered this kind of this action are the Russians. So the IRA, the Internet Research Agency, has this sort of first function, this fire hose capacity to put information in the environment. To give you an example of how much content they can put out, the New York Times is about 300 tweets that they put out a day through about 12 Twitter accounts. The IRA has around 1,000 at any one time, given their competition with platform authorities, and they put out between 15,000 and 30,000 tweets in that same period. So they're able to sort of open up these floodgates and dominate a lot of conversations online. Now that machine gun, that fire hose, needs ammunition, and so the way that you get that is now by automated content generation. And so you may not have known this, but some of the news stories that you read online or on your paper may have been produced by a company called Narrative Science. And they have these tools that allow journalists to take statistics like sports scores, stock numbers, and even polling data and turn that stat into readable prose. And so that computer is generating content for that journalist. But now as those tools have evolved, we get things like deep fakes. So this is when you take a generational neural network and you create video. So you see on the screen there, you have a picture of former President Obama, and that's Jordan Peele, an impersonator. If you care to Google or search YouTube, there's a video of Mr. Peele throwing Mr. Obama's face over his own in a very accurate way to tell us to stay woke. This sort of technology started in a very obscure corner of the internet, but has now come to the attention of folks even like Senator Marco Rubio was talking at Heritage about it the other day. And this is going to be very disruptive, because if I can manufacture lots of content and put it out in a fire hose fashion, and I can aim it precisely at the audience that I want to affect, then I have a very dangerous tool. And that's the last one, this sort of precision targeting. This is actually kind of the more mundane and boring part of AI. And it's the way Amazon recommends your purchases online, or the way Cambridge Analytica did psychometrics. But that sort of thing gets really scary, sort of really creepy, when it starts to want to be your friend. And this app, Replica, it was developed by a Silicon Valley engineer. Her boyfriend died, and she wanted to remember him, and so she took all of the texts and all of the emails that he'd ever sent with her and loaded it into an algorithm, into a machine learning system. And she started to text back and forth with it as a learning function, reinforcement learning. And then they opened it up to some test audiences, and people reacted really, really well to this machine friend. They opened up, almost like they were talking to a therapist. And now that software is out in the open market. They released it. It's been downloaded by about 2 million people. That was back in January. And it's what we call open source software, so anybody can get a hold of it and kind of put it into the algorithm that they want to use to influence folks. And with these technologies, disinformation is just kind of a user setting. You just go into the settings, click that little green button, and you're now lying to folks. And you can lie in a specific targeted manner to thousands of people, monitoring that lie, the effectiveness, at any one time. And the pieces to do this are already out there for any competitor to pick up. And so I think that it's a bigger threat than some of these other things, because it gets at the sort of the will to fight. The biggest thing that we're thinking about AI, I believe, in the DoD is drone swarms. So we're talking about like the Chinese drone shows you may have seen, the Seoul Olympics. I think 1,400 little quadcopters. And so it's sort of threatening. You think, well, what if they put grenades on those guys? And then there's a YouTube video again about slaughter bots that can precisely target people. And ISIS, by the way, is using drones to drop munitions. Even David Kilcullen, one of our sort of pillars of counterinsurgency theory, maintains that the introduction of a small drone at the squad level will rival the invention of the machine gun. And this is where I start to doubt a little bit. Because even the sum total sort of production capacity of China, who's cornered the market on drones, by the way, can't necessarily outproduce machine gun bullets with these quadcopters. And the number of dead from ISIS dropped grenades in Mosul probably doesn't rival the amount of dead from the Somme. And a meme may have a very, very small, a tweet, a Facebook post, may have a very minuscule, almost unmeasurable physical effect, but when it's multiplied by virality, by precision, by a receiving audience, it has a tendency to take up physical force. And you would have seen this in the 2016 presidential election, where Kremlin Facebook pages like Blacktivist or Heart of Texas actually mobilized American citizens to go protest in their own streets. About 60 protest events with thousands of people in attendance, and this was without setting foot in the theater. So those individual tweets do actually have physical force that can be exerted on the battlefield. And the next thing that I'm comparing the influence machine to is kind of Siri for soldiers, so task optimization. And this is one of the places where the DoD is making the most progress. So you've got the algorithmic cross-functional team has Project Maven, which has been in the news a lot lately. This sort of task optimization is really great. It's groundbreaking, but it doesn't change the heart value of that function, whether it's intelligence or HR, by any more than like linear changes, sort of, percentage changes to the value of the function. Whereas a meme can have exponential value because of the amount of people that you can reach with it. And I think that this is analogous to strategic bombing that we had in World War II, where the idea was to strike deep into the heart of an opponent's territory to affect the will of the people. That didn't necessarily work out. We didn't understand when we were planning it that that was going to create a collective event, a sort of a shared experience that would actually build resilience in the populace. Whereas this thing, in that phone in front of you, is an isolating event. It's an individual surface that I can create divisiveness, I can divide a populace, and I can keep you from sort of building consensus. And if I can do that, if I can either, one, divide your population, your politics to such an extent that nobody can agree, or I can dilute the environment so that nothing is true, nobody believes anything they hear, then I can affect the physical will or the means to fight. I can make a social media app a defeat mechanism. I think Clausewitz would agree in that he thought that the political object, the value of the object, was the central thing that affected how willing you as an opponent nation would be to commit combat forces to sort of change my political outcome. And with this, I can affect that, once again, before the fighting even starts. And so what does this mean for readiness? Well, for me, I'm a Title X soldier. I can't necessarily affect, I don't have a political mandate to affect the consensus building for use of force. But the tool sets that are used to do that certainly should scare me and my peers into using some of these tools or figuring out how to compete in this space, especially in a foreign audience. We spend about $7 billion a year on automation, specifically on robotics, but not really any on automated influence. There is, however, some space in the 2019 NDAA where we can kind of start to gain ground on this. The NDAA requires a study on artificial intelligence. I think it requires an IO or an information operations line of effort. There's the Joint the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center. They've got a $1.7 billion budget. I believe that also requires an IO piece to it to sort of start to explore how we can take advantage of some of this technology. And then for this audience, for the Army, I think that U.S. Army Futures Command requires some sort of LOE, some sort of function, maybe not a full cross-functional team, but a function to explore influence technology. Not only are they the folks who are going to modernize the Army, but also they live in a hub, an innovation hub that has the human capital that we're going to need to go ahead and take on this challenge. And I've got in the paper 3 specific things that I think we should pursue, at least in the meantime, in order to start to get after this threat, so that we can curate faster than the opponent can lie. So that means I can take information that exists now, I can identify that's an important piece, and I can send it out very quickly while they are adapting to the environment. I can, once again, curate faster than they're going to be able to produce falsehoods. All 3 of these, they conform to Google's AI code of conduct, and they're built on existing tools, so they don't really need to be produced in compartmentalized secrecy. And the first is image processing. So soldiers already carry cameras on the battlefield, and we're putting even cameras on drones now. The image processing that's available on the market, I believe, can filter footage from any number of soldiers that have cameras on them. Whether we use it for B-roll or for streaming footage, we can take that information, just like I think last year we had the deal at the air base in Turkey, where there was a lot of stories about rioting going on, and we were thinking it's going to be another Benghazi. The base commander actually just put the cameras from the security gates on the internet, and all of a sudden everybody realized that, oh, there's like 10 guys out there, maybe 100. At peak. It's not that big a deal. So that truth, if I can get it to the right audience, I think is very, very powerful. And then narrative science. I mentioned this sort of journalistic tool. Our mission command data feeds, our ABCS, they produce positional data that looks a lot like stock data or polling data. It's already in a usable format, and I think that we can feed that into some algorithm, produce press releases at a pace that we could never have expected to do in the past. And then the last one here is chatbots. So that's when you're talking to somebody's tech support, and there's actually a robot on the other side. There's not a PAO in the world that can probably memorize every line of DoD policy that a reporter might grill them on, but a machine can. And so I think that aiding these PAO folks in a very aggressive, very competitive press environment, they could do a lot of good if they had a chatbot backing them up. And so I want to bottom line this with the moral of the story here isn't about narratives. It isn't about elections. It's about rate of technology adoption. And we got beat. We've seen technology disruption or strategic communication technology disruption before. You see up there I've got a picture of Martin Luther. So in 1521, he's printing 4 times as many German works as his Catholic anti-Reformation peers, his opponents. And he's able to achieve a sort of fait accompli in the information environment, not just from his little corner of Germany and the Wittenberg University, but all the way up into Sweden and Norway and into Britain. And that is a revolution that then equals about 130 years of bloodshed. Fast forward to today, and the proliferation of social media technology looks a lot like what happened in the Reformation, or with printing presses in the Reformation. In 2012, we saw, in 2011, 2012, we saw the flash mobs, we saw the Arab Spring, and the West started to understand the power of these platforms, but they thought it was going to be great, it's just going to be democracy. Well, our opponents realized that that was going to be a tool for competition. And so then we saw the deployment of the Kremlin's weapons in 2016. We just weren't on our feet on this one. Back in 2015, when Putin's starting to test that weapon system in what's called Jade Helm, this big special operations exercise that became a sort of a big press deal because there were some conspiracy theories about it. He was actually seeding some of those. We, at the same time, were just putting out kind of an FRG Facebook manual. We were still whispering about web ops. And I would say that we got beaten to that technology. But with Army Futures Command and with the opportunities with the Army coming to grips with information as a joint function, with campaigning short of armed conflict, and the 2018 National Defense Strategy, I think we have a moment of opportunity. And if we can get these folks who are already on the front line of technology, again in Austin, to work with us, we can produce an ability to get ahead of the cycle, at least stay on cycle. Because if we don't, we're going to not just get beat to the next app, the next Facebook or Twitter. We're going to get beaten to the next big area, whether that's voice, video, economic media, or augmented reality. And I don't think we can afford to do that again. This technology is out there today. In fact, in the news, there's Saudis that are influencing the social media space around the current ongoing sort of not crisis, but scandal with their government. And so our peers and our opponents are out there on your smartphones. You can see this material in front of you. And regardless of what China or Russia or even ISIS do on these surfaces, the platforms, the technology is going to continue to progress because it's highly lucrative. The attention trade, there's a lot of money in it, so people are going to continue to develop the technologies. We have to get on board with it. And so with that, I'll go ahead and end my piece. Thank you very much, sir.
All right, thank you. Well, you can see, as I said, a wide range of topics from excessive dependence on space-based comms to the rise of siege as a tactic, and then the challenges with coalition warfare, and wrapping up with the IO machine gun problem here. So with that, what I'd like to do is just open it up to the audience for questions, either individually or en masse, or however you want to direct it.
Hi, I'm Dan Roper from the AUSA's Institute of Land Warfare, and you all made some spectacular insights that I'm kind of curious about. Where do we go forward? Because the first couple presentations really were arguing for speed, as well as the last presentation. You know, we can tactically do things much quicker than we ever did before. But then the concept of what's decisive comes up. And, you know, we're 17 years into being very quick in Afghanistan and the Mideast, tactically making great advances, but we haven't quite solved what's decisive and what's meaningful. So I'm interested if you've read into what's coming in multi-domain operations and what was multi-domain battle. It clearly talks about getting us into positions of dominance across the domains to temporarily achieve something that we can, you know, that's actually physically impossible to maintain. But how do we keep our eye on the bigger picture as opposed to just going faster and faster, but not getting a solution? And I apologize if that's not a clear question, but it's reconciling two different aspects: the technological ability to do things much more rapidly and to scale than we've ever been able to do before. But at the end of the day, no matter how much we automate it, we're talking about affecting the will of people. And people haven't evolved quite as fast as the technology that we're discussing. Thanks.
Yeah, so it's kind of the quintessential strategy question. You have ways and means, but how do you link them to get the ends? And you guys go ahead.
Sir, I'll throw the first one up and see if I can hit this one. So with multi-domain operations, I think we're given an opportunity to get ahead of where our opponents are reacting to us. You look at the Chinese, and they started out in 1999 when we were bombing Serbia and figured out we have to break their systems. And we're evolving, and speed is going to be with us. We're just going to have to figure out how to cope with it, and also cope with the diversity of systems out there that no sort of warfighting organization in the world or in history has ever had to do. And I think we've got to do about three things, and General Perkins is going to be able to crack my knuckles if I get it wrong. But I think first we've got to be able to understand our capabilities. That young major or captain, that company commander, has to be able to understand the tools at his disposal. He's got to be much, much broader than he was, you know, even 10 years ago in understanding cyber, space, as well as air, land, and sea. And that broadening is going to require training both at the institutional level and also out in the force. And then the next thing is data. Our systems don't like to talk to each other very well. I spent some time with the Air Force, and Link 16 doesn't like to talk to stuff. Well, Link 16 does, but the other stuff doesn't like to talk back into it. F-22s and F-35s can't talk into it. I have a hard time talking to it in the Army. Those data streams have to be absolutely seamless, and then we have to have good Army pace plans because SATCOMs, as my peer pointed out, just aren't going to be there. And the last thing, sir, and I'm glad that you hit this up, I think the key thing that we tend to miss when we're getting our heads around all these changing technologies is that the piece, the human domain, that human nature of war is the constant. When we focus on the change, on the delta, I think we miss something, especially given that multi-domain operations focuses on the enemy decision. I'm going to impose a dilemma on that opponent, and I can't do that if I don't understand, you know, the brain behind the enemy tank. So I would say those three things, sir: broadening, seamless data streams, and then focus on the human domain.
I think that was a really good question, sir. I think there's and I'll be really brief. There's a big issue in the future that we're going to have to address in time, in the competition between like military time, like you said, that we always want to go faster and faster and faster, and political time. Politics has not gotten faster appreciably, other than we can now send messages a little bit faster. And I think we in the military are going to hurt ourselves eventually by going faster and faster and faster, because we're going to get told we have to stop or slow down because you have to let politics move and evolve and interact. And if we base all of our success on pure speed, it's going to hurt later. I think a more valuable idea at the operational and above level is we need to find a way to try to control the tempo or the rhythm of the campaign as opposed to just being faster. There are absolutely times and ways that we're going to have to be faster, but I don't think that we need to figure out a way to get control of tempo instead of just relying on speed. And I mean, my example is like nuclear weapons. Like, if you're fighting an adversary that's got nuclear weapons, you can't just go fast. Every move is a strategic dialogue and negotiation. And so we're gonna have to really reevaluate and figure out that problem, the tension between military time and political time in the future.
Thank you. My name is Maggie Feldman-Pilch. I'm an AUSA member and just an interested bystander. I have two questions, one for Major Boyd. I'm curious, you first mentioned the geographic limitations of our SATCOM, specifically where we can communicate. And as I ask this, I'm thinking mostly about Russia and the Arctic, but how do you think where we can communicate, those limitations are going to be impacted by climate change and where we see conflict? And then generally, I guess to all of you, there's a component of human capital in all of your research. And you represent, of course, the best and the brightest that the Army has to offer. But there are lots of barriers to entry into national security. And I wonder if you think the problems we're facing now, how different they would be if perhaps our armed forces were a bit more representative of our general population.
I guess we'll stick with the alphabetical order for answering. But yes, if climate change creates new shipping lanes in the Arctic, and if there are more opportunities, economic opportunities in the Arctic's going to be more contested between the stakeholders in that area, Russia being one of them. The land that is adjacent to those waters, of course, that will be contested as well. And I think climate change will cause us to be more likely to fight in areas at northern extremes. Of course, parts of Norway, the northern half of Norway actually, Sweden, Finland, the Baltic would still be, Baltic still in that area, but of course all of northern Russia. So I think it would increase the likelihood that we would be fighting north of 65 degrees latitude, where SATCOM simply does not work, which is all the more reason to be prepared to have an alternative to satellite communications.
It's an HR question, and to be fair, thank you. I do run an organization that looks at professional development opportunities for women in national security, so that's part of why I'm asking this question. But as a millennial who uses quite a bit of Twitter, the last paper was not a surprise to me, and you spoke as if it was. So I just wonder, from all of your perspectives, different backgrounds, similar age bracket, if the armed forces looked like our population, would these problems that you're looking at be different?
Well, so thank you for that. Actually, there's a book out, Like War, that covers a lot of the stuff that I cover. As I was sending it to Ms. Toner, Like War was coming out, and then I read it and realized that we overlapped quite a bit. So I'm not the only one in the field. And AUSA just had a panel, like what was it, last week in the big conference, where they were talking about digital engagement. And young people that are coming into the Army, I just use that term, so younger folks are engaging a lot more in social media. And you see them reaching out to senior leaders like General Abrams. He is a huge engager on social media. So I think it's not so much us changing the force as the folks coming in changing, or the force changing the people that come in for them. I think it's them changing us, and that's probably a positive thing, because there are some adaptations that a big institution has a tough time making in a planned fashion. But these folks coming in are going to be able to innovate a lot better than probably we were.
I'll jump in real quick too. I think to build on that point, the problem is the Army, I don't know how reflective it is or isn't of society, but I do know that soldiers coming into the Army don't have a lot of say in the decisions that are made and the things that are pushed forward. And so I think that's part of the problem too. It's not that the society and the Army don't necessarily reflect each other. Again, I don't have data on that, so I can't speak to, I assume you have more? Okay. But I just think that they're just not in positions of power and positions of decision making. So while that knowledge does reside, so like that may resonate with everybody that's 22 and below, but for somebody that's like 38 and been in the Army for 14 years now, I'm like, that's interesting. But the problem is the people that get it aren't anywhere to influence anything beyond, you know, a selfie with General Abrams at PT or something. So
I think that's a really good point. I'll be really brief. I do think we need a little bit more representativeness. I think, like Amos said, though, you know, they're not moving up, and I don't have the data yet on it. I want to write a paper on it, but a cursory look at history seems to be like a lot of the when you think of really, really extraordinarily successful commanders, a lot of them tend to be relatively young, especially in major transition periods. Napoleon rises pretty young. You know, Eisenhower and Patton were promoted from 06, essentially, right at the start of the war. So, and again, I don't have the data on it, but it seems that when, at a certain point, I would admit to myself, I think I probably am getting to the point where I'm not changing anymore. I'm not necessarily going to be able to adapt and integrate these new things. And so I think there's probably at some point, if there's a big enough crisis, there needs to be a look at how do we move things up fast enough so you get some of these new people that have a different perspective up into decision-making positions quicker. That's probably what I think.
Hi, good evening. My name is Eric Placencia, and my question is for Major Telley, and it's a two-part question, but I want to preface and say that I completely agree with you. I think AI and deepfakes is a huge national risk. I think the idea that a computer can mimic the voice and physical attributes of a person to invoke havoc amongst the populace is pretty serious. Now, my two-part question is, one, I think the reason why the Russians were so successful in 2016 is that they understood us as a people, as a cultural, and then as a culture, essentially. I think American culture is one of the major sources of power that we have around the world, and the fact that they understood us, and in order to turn that around back to us, is one of the reasons why they were so successful. Now, the question is, can we do the same thing with them? Do we understand the Russians, for example, in order to do the same thing that they did to us? Second, what about countries that control the flow of information? Now, in the States, we have freedom of speech and freedom of information, and everyone has access to all that information. What about states like China that control all sources of information? If they can block their own citizens from essentially seeing the images and the text and the videos that we create in order to influence their population? Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much for two good questions. The first one with our culture as a source of power and sort of being able to turn that back on another culture. I don't think we can photo negative what they did because of our sort of professional and our narrative position. Like, we're the good guys. They're fighting from the guard. They can hook and jab and scratch and claw, and it's not a moral issue for us. We are still the behemoth. We are still the biggest economy. We still have the biggest military. And some of the things that they did, I don't think that we are sort of philosophically capable of, nor would we maybe not want to do it. That's why one of the reasons I put curate faster than they can lie. I want to tell the truth faster than they can disseminate a falsehood. So I don't think so. There's probably some sort of, shadier things that some other government agencies could do. But from an Army perspective, I don't think I can do kind of what they did to us in the divisiveness. But the second part, I think that's a really awesome question as well, in that if I'm going into what is essentially a denied environment, something where like Mubarak cuts off the access to his people, or in China where they control the digital environment, I think there are some really interesting opportunities for us to figure out that problem set in that in 2011, the thing that allows those protesters to communicate is like a line of code that some kid like in Silicon Valley writes and like sends over email, and it ends up being what we call fire chat. It's an app that's then used in Hong Kong for guys to use the Bluetooth on their phone, which would otherwise just talk to your headset or your computer or whatever, to bounce point-to-point communication to get to somewhere to get that communication out. And it was really powerful to get footage of Tahrir Square out to the world through this point-to-point connection. And I think as we look forward, you're going to look at stuff like augmented reality. So you got a kid playing with Pokemon Go, where he's looking at the phone, and there's a digital representation that isn't actually in reality that he can see through the phone. I think there's opportunities to have digital graffiti. So why not, if there's a dictator that we don't particularly like, that we're supporting some sort of government or some sort of unconventional action, why can't we draw graffiti, or the people in that country draw graffiti all over their Capitol building that only they can see? Because not only is that a powerful tool to show that, hey, they don't have total power, but it's also an in-group building function that I have this thing on my phone and you can't see it. And then also it has dual use in a disaster. That augmented reality icon can be a rally point if we're having a flood, if there's forest fires or whatever. I can plop down things that will help people in an environment, and I can get to them quicker. I hope that answers the question.
George Nicholson, the Washington representative for the Global Special Operations Forces Foundation. I talked to Major Boyd earlier. About a year ago, I was at a session with the Commandant of the Marine Corps, Bob Miller, and he stood up and said the biggest threat the Marines face in the future is our dependence upon GPS and SATCOM. And he said a month earlier, I was in Afghanistan driving around with some of my Marines, and I said, can you show me on the map where something is? They looked at me like I was a dinosaur and said, sir, we don't use maps anymore. I got my smartphone and I've got my tablet. Well, he's gone ahead and pulled the plug on a lot of exercises of forcing the Marines to learn to read maps again. And sort of the question is the Army doing that now? A week later, I was with Admiral Richardson, the Chief of Naval Operations, and brought it up, and he said, you've been reading my emails. I said, what do you mean? He says, I asked the same question. We had a military Sea Lift Command ship that got lost in the Mediterranean, and we've had instances with other ships in the Persian Gulf. Alluding to what you said, Major Telley, about the book by Pete Singer, which is like war. If you haven't read that, that's absolutely fantastic, but it's a weaponizing of social media and how that's being used. But his previous book, Ghost Fleet, Notional Third World War against the Chinese, of how they're able to hijack our satellites, use our satellites against us, and use our dependence upon those. So I guess the long-winded thing is, what are the Marines, what's the Army doing right now to do the same thing the Marines are doing?
Well, sir, I'll answer this first. As the guy until very recently owned basic training, ROTC, and all the officer training in the Army, we have hard copy map reading in all of those things, from basic training on, not GPS. And very interesting, we have found in ROTC and our officer basic courses, just an aside, that and so we have PT tests, we have leadership scores, and academic and everything like that. That the single score, if you can only pick one score of all they get, that was the best predictor of success in the course, and then as we followed them on, success in the Army was how they did on land navigation. And the reason was, as we pulled this back and got a lot of experts, is because we found out that it's not only your ability to read a map, but it's your decision-making and judgment criteria, that if you're on a land nav course and it's night and now you missed a point you're trying to calculate, well, do I go back and get the point? How much time do I have? I could get 10 points by that, but I'll lose 5 points by this. So the judgment and decision making and operating under pressure and all those things that comes with a mounted land nav, we found is the single best determinant on their ability to execute leadership further on. And so that's just a second reason why in the Army, at least in Trading and Doctrine Command, it's all hardcore map reading, land navigation, both from the navigation point of view as well as, most importantly, the ability to apply judgment and react under pressure. So hopefully you can sleep a little bit easier tonight. But these guys out in the operational force, I defer to you.
So I do have friends out at the combat training centers, and they are increasing satellite denial, periods of satellite denial. It's a very simple technique. You get the serial number for their the transceiver on their joint battle command platform, and there's a period of time where they just shut off connectivity for what is the map on the screen. And so they have periods of time when they do that. As well, we've been directed for our brigade for our platoon lanes to have at least 3 periods of time, 3 periods during our platoon exercises where our platoons do not have GPS. The length of time depends on how sadistic the operations officer is, I guess, but still trying to figure out how long that's going to be. And as well, there's mandatory jamming as well in there for the platoon training.
And then also again, we're in the same brigade, so we do a lot of this together. But 1st Armored Division right now is going through its warfighter. We start it next week, and as part of that, we've done a series of CPXs. And again, this is just for one division, but all that's been done on maps and acetate. The briefs from the division staff to the CG are all hard copy acetate maps, and so my battalion's replicating a brigade in the division, and we do the same thing. And I think the shortcoming right now and all that is just understanding what the map means, because you can look at a map and understand it. You can go out and walk from point to point, but then when you get out and try and fight, what does that map mean to the fighting formation? And I think that's probably where we're still working to recover some of that skill that we've lost over the past several years. Sir?
I think we have time for the official last question. There always has to be the official last question. I think, was there one in the back there?
First of all, thank you guys for an excellent panel. I'm Jeremiah Rosman, the National Security Analyst at the AUSA. There were so many good questions, and many of them were already asked. So I guess I'll ask one that's a little bit more specified than to the siege warfare. First of all, a lot of the modern sieges that you mentioned were carried out by Russia. Are democratic countries as capable of using the siege as a tool, as an authoritarian country, just in terms of, casualties and the necessity of isolating a population and contracting and closing them off? And secondly, with the increased likelihood that there might be warfare in megacities and the geographical limitations of tightening a siege against so big a geographical entity, what are the alternatives to sieges in that regard?
So the first part of your question, I think the answer is yes. So again, Mosul was a siege. We did Mosul. The 9th IA, the Fed Pol, the PMF, is the right term? Yeah, the PMF. Sorry, there's some slippery slope stuff there. And some other units from the 9th IA were supported by us, but it was largely a proxy fight. So this goes back to the point of proxy wars. We try and hide what it is we're doing more so than, say, Russia. Now, Russia tried to hide early on what they were doing in the Donbass, but quickly at Ilovaisk, when 100 T-90s are coming from Rostov across the border into Ilovaisk, it quickly became apparent that Russia was at play there. Whereas we try and put a facade on what it is we're doing, but it's essentially the same thing. It's just proxy war. So Mosul is a good example of that. And then again, Marawi in the Philippines. Marawi is in a very similar state. It's a smaller city than Mosul, but it's in a very similar state to that of Mosul. And it was fought almost the exact same way, with a little less conventional flavor on the Philippine part, and on our part for that matter as well. But yeah, I think those two battles there are good examples of us, the United States military, conducting our own sieges with the help of our friends, our partners, those that were there to advise and assist. And then can you hit that second question again real quick, please?
Yeah, certainly. So mega cities defined as cities that not just the urban centers, but massive sprawl going out much further, sometimes hundreds of miles, even thousands of square miles. In order to have an effective siege, you need to be able to tighten the noose and not have gaps. And most analyses suggest that it would cost a lot of forces to be able to. It might even be impossible to tighten a noose that wide. So, is there an alternative? Is there a way to isolate specific parts of cities? Is that something that's discussed?
I don't think that there's, so right now I think this is all still a very nascent discussion. I don't think there's a good answer for that. I don't have a good answer. I do know, I think a lot of times we have to remember too what Alexander Svechin said in his book Strategy. He said the first principle of war essentially is to guard against the decisive blow. And in many ways we've created this problem ourselves by our precision weaponry and our dominance that we have. And so nobody wants to go out and put their army in the field and get destroyed or defeated on day one. They want to survive politically, they want to survive militarily, and so they're going to structure their operations in such a way that they do so. So I don't know that problem's going to go away, especially given our proclivity, and it seems a lot of major players in the world's proclivity for proxy warfare. Just in the Middle East alone, there's several other countries there involved in the proxy warfare game. So I just think that that's going to be a natural byproduct of what we deal with for the foreseeable future until there is some parity in the world and folks want to come out on the field and fight tank on tank.
Well, let's have a round of applause for our great presenters here today.
Before you go, let me personally thank General Perkins. Dave, thank you for helping out. And on a personal note, I think you would agree that our Army is in pretty good hands going forward with this kind of up-and-coming leaders. So let's give them a round of applause again. Thanks, guys. Thank you very much. Keep writing for us. Keep writing for us. I wanted to make one announcement before we let you go. 6 November. It's Election Day, right? 6 November. We're having a General Lyman Lemnitzer lecture here that evening after you vote by Colonel Retired Doug Mastriano. Many of you remember Colonel Mastriano did the seminal work on Sergeant York and presented here 2 years ago, I think, on his work that he did on Sergeant York, and he's published a book recently on Thunder in the Argonne, the Battle of Argonne, as we continue to commemorate the end of the First World War. So if you can make that or tell your friends, that's November 6th. It'll be in here at 5:30. So I'll let the guys stay around for a little bit, and if you have additional questions, check them out. And if one of those papers grabbed your attention, we've given you a copy so you can do some follow-up reading. But with that, thank you, folks, and have a great evening.